Okay, first thoughts on nuclear deterrence. How shall I put it? The seeds of both what's right and wrong in our heads comes early. All right. Certainly, I guess I should, that's distracting. Sorry. As I mentioned before in the last lecture, we wanted, among other things, in both our bombing of cities in Europe and in East Asia, to get rid of the excuse that we were stabbed in the back. And we wanted to make sure everybody knew, no, you lost. And you lost on the home front. Now, that was, I think, a bit of a post-ad hoc ratio insofar as we didn't have any options other than bombing the cities with what we had in the way of capabilities. But it doesn't mean that that wasn't an incorrect point either. You'll notice that when the emperor surrenders, he refers to the atomic bombings. Now, this and the immediate surrender seem to validate all of the interwar air theory, that not only will the bomber always get through, if you go to the heartland, you can turn off the war and do it rather quickly. Now, all of this is rebuttable, of course, and if you've read any revisionist history, pretty interesting. He had to save face. He just used the excuse of the bomb to surrender because, well, the Soviets were coming, and he couldn't quite say that. Also, the bombing survey that was done for the Air Force in official history, very voluminous and worth pawing through, pointed out that, maybe you really didn't need to do the bombings. Why? Well, we were starving them to death by naval blockade. And, they were on their knees anyway. And had we done a bit more of it, the war would have been over. Again, good luck sorting all this out, but it does put you at least in creative tension. I think what's interesting historically about this creative tension, if you will, over what the truth might be, is that the scientist movement, which is a group of people who worked on the Manhattan Project, were very adamant that the bomb not be used against the Japanese. I mean, they were all assuming it would be used against Hitler. That's the reason they signed up. They wanted to make sure that Hitler not only didn't get the bomb first, but that if we had to, we would use it first against him. And when that wasn't the case, they said, now, wait a minute, we didn't buy in on this. They had a number of views about deterrence and the bomb that pretty much accorded with that interwar theory, that you go after cities, there are no defenses. But they also believed that the consequences of nuclear use would be the end of civilization. And within limits, I got to believe with enough bombs on enough cities, they got a point. And they urged restraint so that we could create greater international governance over nuclear energy. The analogy that they liked is, instead of a room with two boxers, 100 by 100, where you could duck and parry and take a blow and give a blow, and it was much more like two machine gunners. That whoever pulled the trigger first, that was it, and they won. Well, there were other views. I think I didn't actually require you to, did I require you to read, did I urge you to read Viner? Was that part of the required readings?
What's about the atomic?
Deterrence.
Yeah.
Viner, okay. I haven't yet gotten a copy of Mr. Borden's book, but probably should. They wrote simultaneous, I'm not even sure they read one another, which shows that medium-sized minds think alike, or even great minds. It's interesting, the exact same period. They were both coming up with, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. In specific, they took on the sort of scientist movement's views. Partly because after the war, even though the scientist movement's recommendation not to bomb Japan was totally ignored, their basic view of how to think about nuclear weapons, and this analogy, really took root. I mean, we had an announcement by the Canadians, all the participants in the Manhattan Project, the Canadians, not all, but the Canadians, British, and the US, that said pretty much the scientist movement's view of these things was something we now have to organize the world around to deal with. So it took root. The counter-arguments took their cue, I'm not sure knowingly or not, from some thoughts that actually came even before nuclear energy was perfected. I think in the notes I take an excerpt from a memo that was written for the British by two emigres from Germany who knew a lot about the nuclear weapons program in Germany, and Otto Frisch and Rudolf Perls. And what they said is that there's no defense or shelter against nuclear weapons if they're perfected, and the most effective reply, therefore, to someone getting these is being able to threaten to use yours against theirs. And they concluded, therefore, it seems to us important to start production of this weapon as soon as possible and as rapidly as possible, even if it is not intended to use the bomb as a means of attack. Now, that suggests that this analogy isn't right. That the threat of counter-use would suggest that no one would ever pull the trigger. Rather than whoever goes first wins, there would be fear and loathing of ever pulling the trigger. Okay. There's a man who's very highly regarded, Bernard Brodie, who's written a lot of popular books. He gets things, I would say, at least a third right. You can tell I'm not as swayed by popular support of his analysis. He wrote a lot of memos saying precisely that the threat of a counterstrike against cities would deter anyone from ever going first in the first place. I think that critique, however, is not as robust as the Borden and Feiner critiques, which make much more sense to me. And I think made much more sense, more important, to people at the RAND Corporation doing analyses of these questions. And I don't know if they read the Borden book, but I do know for a fact that they were very enamored of Feiner, and they're very similar arguments. What did these men argue? First, they said defenses are possible. I mean, if you have nuclear weapons in hardened structures, or if they are passively defended by being dispersed and they're mobile or they're hidden, maybe they can't hit them. They also said it wouldn't make sense to put your nuclear weapons forces in cities because you just invite attack on the city, and that's what you're supposed to be protecting with these things. It just didn't make sense. Also, it would be easier to move around and hide things outside of a city. Then they said quantity matters. If you have more, then they have to target you with more, depending on how you base it. Weiner also was pretty dour about the notion that you absolutely needed to go to international forms of control or world government because of this weapon. I think the line that I like the most is people who say that you have your head in the sand if you don't go to international government may have their heads in the clouds, because although these weapons would reduce the differences between large nations and small nations. It would not eliminate them. There would be advantages to the wealthier, larger nation that could be exploited by passive and active defenses and quantity of deployment. And that because of that, you wouldn't have a total elimination of the balance of power, which was sort of the adage of the day in the 20th century. That would not be eliminated. I think in addition, they were actually somewhat optimistic that because of all of these things, use of nuclear weapons early was pretty darn unlikely. So when the Soviets got their weapon in '49, we had to then start thinking more seriously about this. I mean, this was all, in '46, it was sort of it was like intellectual sandbox activity. You could do anything you wanted, it didn't matter, because we had the monopoly. '49, it got a little more serious. And I said, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Basically, the first response was that of, I think, the view of Bernard Brodie, and I think that's the reason why he is so well known. And that is, well, Churchill says, safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. Boy, if we could all write half as well. Yeah. I think this is wrong and nuts, but is well stated. Persuasively so. The Canadians, to their credit, always are a little blander, but perhaps a little more modulated. The balance of terror has been replaced by the balance of power. So they didn't quite listen to all of the things Weiner and Borden had to say initially when the Russians came out. Another analogy, which was popularized in Foreign Affairs by J. Robert Oppenheimer, is that there would be a situation where there would be two scorpions in a bottle. Now, does anybody understand that when a scorpion uses its stinger, it kills itself? Well, you might be able to kill the other scorpion, but the result would be that you probably wouldn't get all of the weapons he had, and therefore there would be retaliation that would damage you more than anything that would have happened in the Second World War if you were a victor. Or, for that matter, it would be even worse than any defeated power in the Second World War. I think that's the latter point I wanted to make. In other words, victory in the nuclear age would put you in a condition worse than Nazi Germany or Japan because of the retaliation. So, again, the early view of deterrence that it's automatic, it'll go, the weapons will be targeted against the cities, there are no defenses, and that retaliation would wipe you out to begin with, meant that people in '49 just sort of thought, well, all we can rely on is everyone being frightened of one another. Right. This, I think, again, is an extremely incomplete understanding of how these things work, popular though they may be. I keep coming back to it. I studied politics in my youth, and I was told from the outset that all great political ideas, evil and good, are simple. And this is the reason why we're constantly trying to find that bumper sticker expression for whatever it is we're pushing, right? I guess. Life, however, is a bit messier. So, I should note that actually sound politics takes a simple idea that's basically sound enough that it can be qualified and amplified in a way to get people to do things that improve things. Bad ideas, well, just the opposite. But it always starts with something simple.